focus on 2 points of this conversation. So the first point, the objective is how can we actually identify the points of unity in terms of our analysis, in terms of our understanding of global labor migration. Can our two movements, one based in the unions and another based in the migrant justice groups, can we identify those points of unity which form our common ground in our joint struggle against global capital? It's kind of a mouthful, but that's actually what the first panel will explore. Yeah? So building that common ground of joint analysis. The second portion is based on that analysis, what kind of joint action can we undertake, not only in terms of pushing back the agenda of global capital, but also in terms of strengthening the solidarity between these two sectors of workers. Without necessarily limiting the conversation, we have used the title Global Labor Migration. And that is not to deny that there is also internal labor migration. It's not denying that, but the emphasis is on the global. Therefore, there will be speakers who will speak from the point of view of the global south, just as those who will speak from the point of view of the global north. There are at least two speakers who are actually located in terms of their work from the global south. But let me just mention here that last year, in May last year, ACLA, the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance, sponsored a similar dialogue around precarious workers and their struggle, which was written up in a magazine. So this is a kind of follow-through from that that conversation last year, except that now there is a very explicit angle we're exploring. There is a perspective that is valid from the point of view of the migrant justice movement. And there is also a perspective that is also very valid from the point of view of the union movement. Hopefully this conversation will help us actually connect the dots between the two. So that's as far as the agenda and the direction of the conversation goes, unless there's anything else you want to add. Before we move on, I believe we have two people who will lead us in a moment of silence. Would you want to? I'd like to call on Evelyn and Grace. Very sorry.
Hello, everybody. We thought we would start with a moment of silence. Well, first to commemorate and to honor everyone who died in the Philippines in that tragic typhoon. And as many of you know, the Philippines has been a country that has suffered under colonialism, and that is still prevalent today. And it's a country that has basically sold its peoples to the world as commodities, as migrant workers. And now with this tragedy that is confronting the country, there's going to be more need to migrate to work, to survive. So we just wanted to honor the people who are still suffering, those who have lost their family members, and also remember that the Philippines is in a very fragile place in the globe. It's one of the countries that is more susceptible to climate change, and this climate change, we have to see it, of course, as part of the ravage globalization and capitalism that we have. It's largely man-made, and we have the power to organize against the destruction of our planet in so many ways, and the environment is something that we cannot forget in our struggles. So I ask you now to observe a moment of silence for the Philippines.
Since November 15 to December 10, a day or a period of mourning and solidarity with the victims of Typhoon Yolanda or Typhoon Haiyan. We have to remember more than 10,000 people who have been killed by this typhoon that up to now the government does not want to recognize that they have a casualty of 10,000 people, and also devastating 44 provinces in the Philippines. So as we said in our period of mourning, we said we do not only mourn, we also promise and pledge to fight and resist for change. Thank you very much.
So thank you, everyone. Each of the speakers is going to speak for 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for Q&A afterwards. Evelyn, will you start, please?
Yes, I think I'm starting, so I'll just start. I wanted to contextualize migration through some statistics that I was able to derive from the UN, so that way we can visualize what is happening in the world, who's moving, who's not, and then perhaps from there, then we can continue our conversations. There's much more to add, but first we need the fundamentals of who's moving in the world. According to the last statistics available through the UN, specifically the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, in the fall of this year, it was estimated that 232 million people, or 3.2% of the world's population, actually live abroad. And this is compared to 175 million people in 2000 and 154 million in 1990. And again, the United States is the country that attracts the most international migrants. And a lot of studies have shown that, of course, whatever country is causing displacement and has these, particular relations with other nations will be like the pull and push source of many migrants. These are migrants that are considered to be refugees and also economic refugees, even though, of course, in the UN Convention on refugees, economic refugees are not considered as such, right? So we have to obviously expand the notion of who is a refugee, and also look into how many people who are deprived of a livelihood are indeed refugees of a capitalist system that denies them livelihood. This is like, many studies have also talked about this, in particular Grace Chung's work. She has noted that when people are deprived of a job, they're being deprived of living. They're being told that basically they don't have a right to exist. So this is what migration, the other side of migration, is really telling us behind all of these statistics. And then it's also important to note that south-to-south migration has also gone up, and south-to-north migration. But at the same time, as we see that people from the developing countries are coming to the so-called developed countries, there's also a different type of movement that is becoming more common, where a lot of workers' wages are not. When workers retire here in the north, they take their pensions with them to the global south, so that way they can stretch their monies in the developing world. So there's a lot of north to south migration. But when those people migrate, because of the virtue of the fact that they have citizenship status from the first world, the red carpet will be, basically rolled out to them. They will have all this money from here in the north, where they can appropriate, buy lands from indigenous populations. This is particularly troublesome in Honduras. There's many Canadians that are going and retiring in Honduras and buying up lands from the Garifuna peoples that are right by the ocean. So we have to look at, when is it a crisis, or when is there a panic within mainstream media when people move? And it's mostly when people of color move. That's when there's panacea, because those movements are coerced. Most of the time, they're forced movements. People have no other choices but to migrate. And when they migrate, that migration is bound migration where it's controlled, and if it's not controlled, then it's criminalized, as we see with the case of the US and Mexico, which is still in the world today one of the largest migration pull and push migratory movements in the world, and the largest migration corridor around the world. But also throughout the world, we have to remember too that there are many fault lines where the third world and the first world completely grade against one another. If I borrow one of this Chicana feminist phrases, that when we look at Africa, you know, there's many Africans who use the ocean to cross over to the so-called first world, and then we have to think about how many people actually die in their pursuit of life, and their resistance, and their wanting to survive and thrive, and they're wanting to exercise the right to be in this world. That's what migration is really all about: the right to be, the right to exist. And so there are very many fault lines around the world this way. And then Canada, increasingly, we have to see Canada as being part of this fortress in North America that is upheld in the U.S.-Mexico border region. So we have to see ourselves, you know, geographically in a different way. We are also part of the U.S.-Mexico border region, which is the region and the border that keeps people from the third world out. We're part of that, but now Mexico is also asserting that those politics of bordering very forcefully within the border that it shares with Guatemala. We hear of a lot of abuses with the Central Americans who are using Mexico as a gateway into the so-called first world, while Mexican authorities are also, you know, in a position where they're violating the rights of people migrating. So we can't let Mexican officials off the hook for that. And still, men are the ones who migrate the most. Although there is a feminization of migration, women account for 48% of migrants in the world. And in a lot of the UN agencies, they usually frame migration as the right to mobility, as migration as a way for development, migration as broadening people's access to resources. But many times when there are official migration conferences around the world, there's counter conferences where people's voices who are not within these elite institutions in the world could actually be heard, because we have to see migration as not just a crisis of capitalism, because, you know, capitalism, this is what the ILO basically, this is how the ILO sees migration, that it's a crisis of, migration is a crisis of jobs and the lack of jobs in places where people live. But capitalism has always produced fragmentation and displacement, has always coerced labor. So this is something that is not new. And we have to really question what kind of way can we organize our lives that is not dependent on alienation and displacement of peoples. And all of us in the world have the right to the world and the right to move in the world. But there's some people in the world that have no other choice than to leave their families, than to leave their communities. So where is the choice in that? Where is the mobility in that? And there's many communities also, like in Mexico, for instance, that are organizing around the right not to migrate, the right to stay home. So that's something that we have to also bring into our conversations as well, that we're not here in a position to prevent people from migrating, because that's a right that we all have, that we should all have. But we are definitely, as community activists who see how migration can turn, how awful migration can be towards some people who are embodied in a particular way, and those are the people from the third world. And that's what brings me to another point, and I'm sorry if I'm all over the place, but there's a huge discrepancy between the migrants that are considered to be low-skilled migrants and high-skilled migrants. So when we look at Canada's temporary foreign worker programs, and then those programs are several, and we have to understand those programs as an umbrella type of a scheme that the Canadian government has, and under that scheme there are many types of visas, and there are many types of programs. And so some of the most precarious programs are the ones that bound people to work in the most type of precarious work, such as agriculture and services, right? And so when it comes to agriculture, for instance, workers are completely isolated, they live in rural areas, and basically with these programs, they're considered, or their whole entire existence here in Canada is one of statelessness, because they are not. These are not migrants that just graduated from an elite university in France and are working in the farms. No, employers are hiring migrant workers who are already displaced from their home communities, from their livelihoods. They can no longer work in the fields or the particular maquiladora where they used to work, even though of course that was also very problematic, them working for cheap labor for these international companies. These are third world peoples. And just to end on one statistic, one particular study noted that the majority, where did I put it? That the majority of the so-called high-skilled workers that are within Canada's temporary foreign worker programs, the so-called high-skilled ones, they are predominantly from Europe and the United States. But when it comes to the so-called low-skill, they're overwhelmingly our people from the global south, racialized peoples. So we have to keep all of this in mind and see how these temporary foreign worker programs are basically perpetuating a global apartheid that exists in the world, where there's a hierarchy of citizenships and there's a hierarchy of peoples. So these temporary foreign worker programs here in Canada are an expression of that. They're creating hierarchies of skill, but all of that translates into a hierarchy of peoples and a hierarchy of families, where some families could be together and some cannot. And it's a replay and a reproduction of the way that the Canada nation building has taken place since the beginning, because we have to remember that nothing here is new. This has been reproduced through the Chinese Exclusion Act, and now we're seeing it again through the temporary foreign worker programs that affects our peoples from the global south. I'll leave it at that for now.